Today is June 1st, and that begins the official hurricane season. I talk one-on-one with Jared Smith of Charleston Weather, CHSWX on Twitter, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Jared Smith, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks, Quintin. Good to see you.
Yes, sir. Obviously, you have Charleston Weather, which is, a Charleston weather system that gives us daily forecasts and other weather updates. And as you know, today's June 1st, and the hurricane season is here. Let me ask you this. How confident are you that the United States is adequately prepared for the season?
Well, that's always a question. It's always a concern. We've been through a lot in the last year. COVID-19 certainly has taken a toll on our emergency response. But I will say that through all of that, we got through this winter without a government shutdown, which was better than we can say for last winter when the Hurricane Center was shut down for a month, and they couldn't do. And a lot of the preparation that they do happens in the off season, and so we had a full off season. Everybody's operational. Everybody's good. A lot to go over. Obviously, we learned a lot from 2020 rather, it was. It was quite a season, as we know. that broke a lot of records, and we've just it was very rough. We were very fortunate here. Louisiana took an absolute beating. You're going to learn from those things, so with any luck, obviously we have a population that's very storm weary, so I always get concerned about that. But that also tends to increase awareness. So I think that I think we're in pretty good shape overall. I think that there's going to be there's always going to be some challenges there, with the individual storm issues, but. If there's one thing I know is that EMs are some of the most proactive people on the planet. And you should feel confident that if something happens, that something's bound to happen, and you're going to get the forecasts you need, you're going to get the warnings you need, and that you're going to get what you need, and you'll be able to ride it out safely or get to somewhere safe in case you call for evacuation.
And what exactly did you learn, from your weather perspective about last year and the hurricane season?
So I guess last year the thing is never ask could it be worse, because it can be. I think that was certainly one takeaway. Again, I think when we continued to be very lucky, 2020, we got to the name iota in the Greek alphabet, and we've never been that far. We've never been that far. With 30 named storms. Okay, that's absurd. I think that that's even pushing it. That takes 2005, which is the previous bellwether, and that just blows it out of the water. And so, so really, if there's one thing that we have to remember is that we have to be on our guard. We had storms well into November, and that's what typically happens with these kinds of active years. I mean, they just don't give up. I'm starting to see some signs that we're seeing some storms form in areas that are not typically favored climatologically. In fact, we have an example of that right this year. Tropical storm Ana developed from May 22nd to May 24th and was in a part of the North Atlantic that climatologically this time of year does not see storm development. Now, that's not necessarily a bellwether for what's going to happen, but it certainly is something that we're going to want to keep an eye on. We saw this with Florence, a couple years ago. Florence made a very high latitude trek across the Atlantic that 99 times out of 100, that storm's recurving. And it didn't. And so we've got to be, so it just reinforces the need to be vigilant.
How many of those storms like Florence have actually recurved?
A vast majority of them, when they start from that latitude, the vast majority of them, you can look at the climatology and you can look at how and you can look at the typical, hurricane paths there, and what kind of pattern typically sets up there is that they pretty much find a ridge and they'll just whip around it. But what happened in Florence's case was it found a ridge and then that ridge strengthened and built itself over the Atlantic, and any chance it had to escape was cut off. Pretty rare. That's the good news. But again, that's just one. That's just one example. We got to watch very closely where these high pressure systems set up. Last year, we were in a ridge situation that kept us safe, but was funneling all these storms in the Gulf right up to pretty much the same places in Louisiana. And so, it's all a matter of just being observant, watching these things, and just being ready. I think that's the most important. That's the most important takeaway that we have. Right? Is let's be ready for these things. Let's make sure that we know our evacuation zones. There's been a couple tweaks over the years, and people should make sure that they check that out. Hurricanes.sc is a wonderful resource put together by the South Carolina Emergency Management Division. I was going through it pretty much front to back yesterday. It's fantastic. The know your zone stuff is crucial. That's a good thing to know, because you don't want to be trying to figure that out in the middle of with something bearing down. And so I think the thing that we learned the most is that when we are best prepared for these sorts of things, that tends to lower the temperature on this stuff. That tends to that tends to bring down some of that anxiety. Not everyone is going to feel that, obviously, and when we all have the things that we need to get kind of a week out. But I will say is that one good thing coming out of 2020 is that we've all learned a little bit about runs on product. Last year's toilet paper. This year we had that pipeline shut down for a few days, and that prompted some gas issues. And so we've gotten a couple dry runs at these things, understanding that, there will be more things. It's just, sometimes these lines get disrupted, and that's why it's important to be prepared ahead of time. So when the panic does hit, which it inevitably will, you're sitting in a good place.
Absolutely. And you talk obviously about the ridge being rare. How rare has that actually been?
Well, this is the tropical ridge is it's a pretty typical thing that we see in summertime. It's just the positioning can wreak havoc on a certain area. If it's further east in the Atlantic, we need to watch out. Wilmington, Outer Banks, we probably need to be a little more concerned. With the way it was situated last season, though, it just continued to drive, a number of storms, into the Gulf. It was just a very, very, very active year in the Gulf. Isaias was certainly an example where we had that ridge erode a little bit. We had a little weakness develop in that ridge, and it got pretty close. Again, count our lucky stars. We're very fortunate that that our one brush with a storm in the most active year on record. That's Don't be complacent. I'll say that. Don't be complacent, because that luck, it just takes one storm, and it just takes one storm to make the season memorable, to make a season busy. And while we were very fortunate that we had Bertha, which was a spin up and spin down. That was a 12-hour event. And then Isaias obviously was in our news for several days. But that was it. We were very fortunate for that. So we just, so I think the thing that I want to make sure that everybody takes away from this is that we will not always be that lucky. And I hate to say that, but I think that, the thing that, we, weather patterns being notwithstanding, we increasingly have a better idea of, what can the coastline expect from landfalls. Colorado State University has been putting that into their outlooks for a few years, and and I'm hesitant to really go too deeply into that, because they're covering the entire East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and we can't because we can't pinpoint that sort of thing. There's no outlook that's going to tell you how many storms are going to hit your location. So you have to assume that you're going to get affected by one, maybe two, with as active as has been.
And let's talk about the actual season. Do you believe there's actually a chance that we might at least get 60% chance that this season might be an above average season?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good bet. Again, 7th consecutive year now that we've had a May storm. So, I mean, I know that that's not necessarily, again, that's not necessarily a bellwether of how busy it's going to be here. But when you do look at the numbers, you do look at the weather pattern, we still remain in a very active, phase. The waters are warmer. The monsoon season in Africa, that's where the tropical waves will typically come from. That's certainly staying busy. That's been busy for the last few years. We've seen an increase in homegrown systems. Waters in the Caribbean being exceptionally warm. And that can, when you get those homegrown systems, those are the kinds that can sneak up on you quickly. And so, I think an above average season, there's no El Nino. That's the other thing. I saw a long range forecaster tweeting this morning that, maybe a weak La Nina could again redevelop. Let's wait and see on that. But regardless, the neutral phase of the El Nino index, it certainly, it certainly is not anything that's going to hold it back. We'll say that. So you take into account the active waves, you take into account the very warm sea surface temperatures, and that is, that's a pretty good indicator that that above average season is a pretty safe bet.
And you talk about the numbers. What's that 2021 prediction versus the average?
Yeah. So again, when we're looking at the averages now, we have new averages. I think that's one other thing too, is that now that we've moved, we're in 2021, and so the Weather Service and the scientific community as a whole operates on a 30-year climatology. So the climatology previously was 1981 to 2010. At the beginning of the month, beginning of May, we moved to 1991 to 2020. And when I look at those numbers, typically speaking, in that situation, about 14 named storms. NOAA's got 13 to 20. Colorado State has 17. So again, they're going above that climatology. You look at 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. Where Colorado State has 8 and 4 respectively. NOAA has 6 to 10, and then 3 to 5. So right down the middle there, as far as those new numbers go. And so again, and that's an uptick. That's an uptick from the previous normals, because again, we are entering a more active phase. Just in general, we've been in this more active phase now for feels like about 20 years, which is hard to believe. But it is true. And we've made it through with a few gray hairs and maybe some additional stress, but that's about it.
Yes, indeed. And let me ask you this: if this season is going to actually be above average, can this season come out as a weak season?
That's the thing, and that's the thing that these outlooks don't necessarily always are able to take into account, is that yes, we can have 14, 16 named storms, but a lot of times what happens is that those can be fairly weak. However, we live in an era where we have amazing satellites. We can point at any part of the one half of the globe now and set the satellite to update every minute. So we can watch a storm. We can watch a storm literally come together in real time, and literally within a minute that data is down and into the system. So with this amazing high resolution satellite era that we're in, we're going to find storms. We're going to find more storms that we might not have named even 10 or 15 years ago. So that will also add to the number of named storms. And you see a lot of contention about this too on weather Twitter in particular. It's like, I would never have named that. But if it fits if it fits the description, and we have higher resolution data, and we have much more frequent data to tell us these things. We have more dense surface observations, and we're going to be getting a lot of that air traffic back now that the pandemic is over and air traffic is beginning to resume a little bit more. We're going to have more sampling of the atmosphere, just as a matter of course. And so just because we have a high number of storms does not necessarily mean that they're all going to be barn burners. They're, again, Anna lasted 2 days. As a subtropical system, briefly took on full tropical characteristics and then fizzled out just as quickly. And that's a named storm off the list. So I think that is something to balance that out with. Now, that being said, just because a storm is named is not, is necessarily a tropical storm does not mean it's nothing to sneeze at. This year's list, for example, is the 2015 list. 2 names were retired from the 2015 list. One of them, obviously, was Joaquin. We remember Joaquin as being a moisture trap for the 2015 thousand-year flood event here in South Carolina. The other one was Erica. Erica was a tropical storm only, but it was retired because it did significant damage to the island of Dominica.
Right.
Through torrential, just unrelenting rainfall.
That's right.
And so again, again, the winds of a storm, I think the other important thing, and this is something that we've been trying to do a lot just in the weather community, just in general, to drive this home a little bit, is that the wind in a storm is actually pretty localized. The swath of worst winds is a very narrow corridor. It's the water that gets you. It's, you hide from the wind and you run from the water. Our evacuation decisions are not driven by who's going to see the strongest winds. Our evacuation decisions are driven by storm surge and flash flood potential. Always. It is very rare where winds are going to factor in as a major threat. Certainly, you can get a lot of power outages from just tropical storm force winds. I mean, you get a thunderstorm through here that produces 50, 60 mile an hour winds, and you've got problems. You get trees down, you get power lines down. Yes, that's disruptive for sure. And I don't want to minimize that threat. But when we think of hurricane winds, we think of the maximum sustained 120, 130, 140 in these higher category storms. But that's such a narrow part of the storm. That's such a small part of the storm. That might be 3 miles out from the center. And so that's not going to affect the vast majority of people. Now, if it does, that's no good. We saw a great example of that with Hurricane Michael a couple years ago as it went through Florida. With a very narrow corridor. It looked like a large tornado had gone through there. So you don't want to discount that, but I think the thing to take away is that, might have a lot of named storms. And again, it doesn't have to be a major hurricane for it to be very disruptive. Again, 2015 offering a great example of this. Joaquin did not affect us directly, but a storm that was digging in to the west tapped into Joaquin's moisture, and we know how that went. And so right. I think that this thing that I know I harp on it a lot. I know that I'm talking about it a lot, but it is so important to remember is that, especially as sea levels rise, especially as we continue to build on the peninsula, and unfortunately that cuts off more ways for the water to get out. And so we have to be very careful about that, and we have to make sure that that the water is displaced properly, that we are building in a way that does not add to the flood problem. Unfortunately, easier said than done. And the fact is that with sea levels going up, you're not going to defeat physics. That's just the long and short of it. So we can do our best. But all that to say is that, you might have got through something fine in 2015, but in 2021 could be very different. A lot of places look different. A friend of my neighborhood is completely different. It was all woods. They had just opened a new gas station, but it was all woods otherwise. And now there's a Harris Teeter. Now there's a Starbucks. Now there's a Starbucks inside the Harris Teeter. I mean, and so that's a lot of woodland. That's a lot of ground that could soak that moisture in that has been replaced by pavement.
Yes.
So something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And let me ask you this, Jared. Do you think this year will be like 2013?
It's really hard to say. I mean, again, I would say I try not to compare years. And the reason I don't do that is because, again, one storm, and it's potentially the worst hurricane season you've ever had. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo. Right. I mean, nobody talks about any of the other storms in 1989, but everybody talks about Hugo. And again, it only takes one. I think that's the most important thing. It's like you can remember. You can have all of these different systems. I mean, Joaquin didn't even affect us, but that was the one that we remembered for 2015. Right. 2016 was Michael. We had we had several brushes that year. But I mean, it really wasn't. But Michael was the one. That was the one that got us all kind of on edge. and unnerved. 2017 was Irma. Irma barely touched us. So I'm going to say that, I don't want to offer direct comparisons because I don't think that is something that that we necessarily want to do. And in fact, last season, 2020, was still very different from 2005 in many ways. 2005 had stronger storms. 2020 had weaker storms on average. No Cat 5s in 2020. Well, in 2005, we had several Cat 5s. And so again, you have to look beyond the numbers a little bit. You have to dig into the data a little bit more. And yeah, I mean, it's just it's something that I caution everybody. Every storm is different.
And I know you froze just a little bit. Oh yeah, you froze just a little bit. But how weak will the trade winds be?
So I mean, so that's the thing. We have the westerlies, are a little weaker, and so again, when you get some of those weaker upper level winds, what happens is that you relax the wind shear, and when you have relaxed wind shear, that gives hurricanes room to breathe. Gives them relaxed wind shear, high sea surface temperatures, get a little spin up. You don't have anything shearing off the tops. A hurricane needs to be very symmetrical in order to keep its heat engine going. Any tilt in the vortex will throw it off and will not allow it to intensify. This is a little bit different from a typical land-based severe thunderstorm situation in which we are looking for a fair bit of wind shear to tilt those updrafts. In a hurricane, you really don't want that. So again, that's going to be a pattern that we're going to need to watch closely. It all depends on, again, you get those high pressures where those high pressure systems set up aloft. High pressure aloft is a good thing for hurricanes and can help them vent out. And so, we're going to have our share of, increased wind shear. We're going to have our share of, high pressure days, and we just gotta keep an eye on how these patterns evolve over the next few months.
And do you foresee La Nina returning later in the hurricane season?
So again, yeah, I saw that mentioned as a possibility. I'm not going to speculate too much. The forecast right now is for ENSO neutral, so no La Nina, no El Nino, right in the middle. If La Nina does kick up a little bit, then maybe we see another uptick. And again, remember that last year's forecast was revised up significantly mid-season. So that is, that's always a possibility. But right now, everything seems sound with the kind of the La Nina calming itself down earlier this spring, getting into more neutral conditions. But again, it's certainly something that we're going to keep an eye on, because there are some data sets that are suggesting that is a possibility. And so we'll need to keep that in mind.
And what were those neutral conditions earlier this year?
Yeah, so basically, what happens typically. So when you have an El Nino, you have a cooling in the Pacific, and what that will do is that will mess up the wind patterns downstream. You get a lot more troughs in the east, and that will tend to suppress hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Because again, as I mentioned before, you need really calm winds aloft to make a hurricane do its thing. And so El Ninos tend to disrupt that. La Nina, on the other hand, is an abnormal warming there. And so that kicks off a lot of Pacific activity, but also you don't see as much of the troughiness downstream. The jet is going to run a little bit higher. As that jet runs a little bit higher, you're going to have, calmer conditions overall aloft over the Atlantic. And again, just given the fact that sea surface temperatures have been running consistently above normal now for several years, that is always going to be a factor, and that's something that we're going to have to watch very closely.
And how many storms will actually come off the coast of East Africa?
Hard to say. Again, they have it's a pretty rough road through much of the Atlantic. That's almost an impossible thing to forecast. Again, you can have plenty of homegrown storms. And in fact, in June, the typical place for storms to form is, closer to home, Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, maybe parts of the Atlantic near the Gulf Stream. You can see storms spin up there. Something that we're going to be watching out for really in the first couple months of the season is going to be, stalled cold fronts. And because you can still get a late season front down this time of year, and more often than not, it's going to stall out before it can make it too far south. And you can see waves develop along that cold front, and sometimes those waves gain tropical characteristics. So that's something that we're obviously going to watch out for in the first couple months, June and July. As we get into August and September and October, that's when we start shifting our attention more to the east. That's when the sea surface temperatures and the wind shear tends to relax the most, and that's when we start seeing some of our longer-lived Cabo Verde storms, so to speak. Cabo Verde season begins to kick up. So hard to put a number on it. It's one of those things that is still very requires kind of knowledge of conditions that is unknowable this early. But generally speaking, we see the vast majority of our activity in from August to October, primarily because so much of the ocean is quote unquote open for business.
Wow. And speaking of early and obviously talking about June, what's that percentage of name storms that actually happen in June?
It's typically, it's typically less than 5% usually. I mean, we don't see a lot of name storms in June. It's just not a thing that happens. Again, if we're going to see name storms, they're going to spin up. They're going to spin up pretty close to the coast. They're going to spin up in the Gulf. They're going to spin up in the Caribbean. Typically along frontal boundaries. Typically along, just clusters of thunderstorms that can get going, get some pressure falls going, and then you have a storm spin up. But the good news is that, again, those don't have a lot of runway to get really strong. So you might see a minimal hurricane, but the vast majority of your major storms are going to be later in the season. So it's not to say don't let your guard down. There certainly is plenty of opportunity. Again, as we discussed before, tropical moisture. A tropical storm is a very efficient rainfall producer. It does not need to be a major hurricane to cause a major problem.
And so let me just ask you the obvious. Besides Anna, what are the other name storms for this particular season?
So we're doing something new with names this year in that the overflow list is not the Greek alphabet. So the Greek alphabet is done. The World Meteorological Organization realized that when you have storms Theta, Eta, all at the same time, it all sounds the same. It all runs together. And, the Greek alphabet also is not in our typical, in Latin terms, is not alphabetical per se. So the Greek alphabet is gone. We're not doing that anymore. 2021's names, though, our next storm is Bill, and followed by Claudette, and then Danny, and then Elsa replaces Erica. Interesting name, considering that it's hard to get a hurricane when things are frozen. Right. Fred and Grace, Henri, Ida, Julian replaces Joaquin. So that's another change from the 2015 list, which we are recycling this year. And then you go to Kate, Larry, Mindy, Nicholas, Odette, Peter, Rose, Sam, Teresa, Victoria, Victor, not Victoria, Victor, and then hopefully we don't get to Wanda, because that's the last name on the list. And then from there we roll over to the supplemental names, which run the gamut from Adria to Emery to Foster, Kenzie, Lucio, Michaela, Viviana, and then Will. There's a lot of it's a much more diverse list as far as as far as names this year, and then it ends on Will. And if we get to Will on the supplemental list, oh boy, man, are we in trouble.
And let me ask you a really silly, simple question. What got those people from the Greek names to now supplemental names?
Yeah, again, it just came out of the confusion that arose last year when we got so far into the Greek alphabet that we had so many things repeating. It sounded like so many things repeating themselves. Right. Theta, Eta. It's like, what storm are we talking about? When you have multiple Greek names going on at one time, again, when we were in 2005, we didn't get very far. I mean, that's just. I mean, and there were one-offs, and they were usually not happening more than one time, and they did not affect land. This year, we had Greek storms affecting land. We had Greek hurricanes. I don't want to call them Greek hurricanes. Greek named hurricanes making landfall, and we had multiples of those. And so, it's just from a preparedness standpoint, from a communication standpoint, it just made it very difficult. And so, getting a supplemental storm name list helps us. If we do, God forbid, we roll into that. Again, that's only happened 2 times, and it's not forecast to happen this year. And it looks pretty unlikely that it'll happen this year. La Nina last season, pretty strong, and it's just a confluence of events that is fortunately still rare. So hopefully we don't need this supplemental list, but if we do need it, it's going to be a little bit easier for the public to understand. It's going to be a little bit easier to communicate. It's just going to be simpler to work with, just in general. It's going to be a little more like we're used to, and not so much far off the beaten path as like, ooh, we've gone Greek. Because the other problem is that the Greek names by the Greek alphabet, when you retire those names, you technically can't retire those names because the Greek alphabet is this fixed construct. It's not something that's selected by the World Meteorological Organization and can have names swapped in and out from time to time. In this case, and it's like, so in the case of Eta, Hurricane Eta was retired in 2020. So they retired the name Eta 2020. But the problem is, if they had kept the Greek alphabet, what if it happened again in 2021 and you had another Eta? And the whole point of retiring names is so that people do not, see, oh no, not another Joaquin,
right,
not another Hugo.
Right.
And so the point is to be sensitive to the populations that were gravely affected. And you just couldn't do that with Greek names.
And let me ask you one last question. I wanted to ask you this, but do you actually know where exactly the locations in your mind will be the most at risk this season?
All up and down the coast. I mean, again, I think that's the most important thing, and I think that you're going to find that, Charleston tends to luck out. Our geography still helps us in many ways. The fact that we are a little bit, we have an interesting curve between Georgia and the Grand Strand. Obviously, you get into the Grand Strand, you get into places like Wilmington, you get into places like Cape Hatteras, the Outer Banks. Those areas tend to stick out a little bit more, and your typical recurve paths are going to affect those places a little bit more. So that is, that certainly is, geographically speaking, that does put us at an advantage. Savannah, Georgia has not had a hurricane landfall in 100 years, direct hit in 100 years. Wow. I mean, and so because of, and geography has a big part to do with that, but it does not mean we're impervious to that. I mean, Hugo should put aside all, speculation that we would be impervious to such a thing, and that it can happen. And so I'm going to ask people to, I think the one thing that, if we take away anything from this, the one thing I'm going to ask people, prepare as if we are ground zero. Prepare as if we are going to be seeing 5, 6, 7 storms. And I hate to say that, but that has been the reality for some places in recent years. If they get one, chances are they've got a few coming back to them. So we need to be prepared for the possibility of a major strike. We need to be prepared for the possibility that, that we may have, major disruptions. Not saying that's going to happen. I think that's the most, that's the most important thing, but we need to be ready for it. Because again, if you're ready for such a thing, if you're ready for it now when there's nothing out there, it's a lot less stressful when the time comes, because then you can just put your plan into action and go. And that saves everybody time. That saves a lot of problems. And so I would encourage people to do their part on that. And the other thing that I'm going to encourage people to do is, if you haven't already done so and you're able-bodied, please get vaccinated. That's going to make the evacuation. COVID is still around. I think that's the first thing that we all need to know, is that we are making great progress, but COVID is still around. It's still a thing. And so it is important for those of us who are able-bodied to get your course of vaccine. It's free. It's free. It's very available. No reason not to do it. Because that way, if you have to evacuate somewhere, you're not potentially carrying in a new COVID outbreak. Because again, you have that vaccine, you're less likely to be carrying it. And that was a big concern with last year's evacuations out of Louisiana, and because we did not have the vaccines at this time last year. We were still very much in lockdowns. And so a lot of concerns that a lot of movement would stir up new cases. And so again, the best thing that you can do so you don't get sick or you don't get others sick, get vaccinated. I know that's not necessarily weather, but it's still emergency management, because if we don't have to deal with a pandemic and a hurricane season at the same time, we're light years ahead of where we were last year.
Dr. Jared Smith, thank you so much for your time. And welcome back to Quintin's Small Cells.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.